Actually, I don't mind either way. I went by Matt as a kid and Matthew as an adult, so I don't know. Yeah, actually, I met Kate as Katie, and she hasn't gone by Katie in forever. It's to the point that now, like, that's my nickname for her. Like, if you call her Katie, I'm probably gonna be like, hey, wait a minute, the oh, my middle name is Benjamin, so Kate calls me Benji all the time. She calls me Benji all the time. That's almost all she ever calls me is Benji. Yeah, she'll do that. You know, fun fact, I actually wanted to go by Ben for a while, but I didn't think I could ever work that out, so I always liked that. I know, Benji's great. Right? Yes. There was a dog named Benji. I'm not sure what Kate's trying to tell me. She might mean something. I don't know what. Kate's probably trying to communicate something with that nickname. I don't know. Okay. How much time do I have? Still a few minutes. All right, so you guys were having a feverish discussion about Bibles. Is that what I heard? Okay. Yeah, this one, that's a good point. So this one I will go through Genesis. I don't know if I'll continue on into Exodus or not, but because we've already done several in my time here, I'll skip those. I won't redo those. I don't know. I don't know if I'll go straight through and then skip the ones we've done or not. I never do that. I won't do that. I'll find one after this. The thing is that studying Genesis is like a year. It's like 50 some odd chapters. I mean, it takes a while. That's also, yeah, that's fair. Not that we're not now. I just want to point that out. Not currently old, but someday will be. Not yet, but we're getting there. All right. I'm going to go ahead and welcome you, and I'm going to get started so I can tell you all the other things before we get started on the Bible study, which is going to be amazing today. So I want to welcome you whenever you are. Thank you for being here. So last week I used a couple of Cherokee metaphors to help explain clan and family and stuff like that. And yesterday, I had this random opportunity come up yesterday to drive out to eastern Oklahoma and meet with Madison Horn. Madison Horn is a candidate running for U.S. Senate this year, and I don't often, have a chance to talk to people who are running for the Senate. And I also, from the pulpit, I cannot officially endorse anybody, so I'm not doing that. That said, she grew up in the same town that my family's allotment is in, and now lives here in Oklahoma City. She's also a Cherokee, and we met through Jay Hanna, who is, now he's the senior vice president for something at Bank First. He's a really great guy and has been heavily involved in Cherokee stuff and with my family for a long time. He's like, y'all need to connect because Madison has a strong passion for reaching out to marginalized people, and that's part of what her campaign is about. Might be an opportunity for you guys to get some publicity if you share with her what you're doing. So through a random series of events, I got invited out there yesterday to talk to her. So I did for a long time, her and her team. and they're interested in coming out to Stockyard City to hang out with us for a little while, which we'll have to kind of disconnect from their campaign, but at the same time, we might also get some media coverage for what we're doing out there, which could help us significantly with donations. And so I was really excited about the opportunity to draw a little bit of attention to what we're doing, and I've been trying to do that through Mayor Holt's office as well, and so hopefully that'll work out. But because I was out there, I went ahead and stopped by the reservation, had a chance to pick up a couple of things that I've been waiting on, and I thought I would share some of these things with you this morning since we were talking about some of that stuff last week. So I'm going to pass some stuff, or I'm going to set a couple of things out and just pass them a couple of other things around for you. I don't know, is anybody in our congregation that you're willing to share? Do you have any indigenous ancestry in your family tree, North American indigenous ancestry? A lot of us do. Okay, a lot of us do. My family is just really heavily wrapped up in that. I'm just under half Cherokee. I'm like 40%, or half indigenous between the different tribes that make up my family, so I'm about 40%. My name, Scraper, is a bad translation of Cherokee word Disugatski, which means to scrape or claw at the skin. It's something our medicine people did before our stickball games. Lacrosse is the evolution of a game we play still called stickball. And it's something that we did to our warriors where we would use an old wolf's bone and scrape the skin. It was a cleansing ceremony before battle kind of a thing. And my great-great-great-granddad was a medicine person in the tribe. And one of the European folks who was sitting around saw him doing this to one of the groups of warriors and started referring, his original name was actually Sudalitihi, which means six killer. And they started calling him the Scraper, or the old man Scraper. So he took that name. Today, all of the six killers and the squirrels and the scrapers in the Cherokee Nation are all related. And we comprise 3 of the original 13 surnames of the Cherokee Nation, so Scraper being one of those. I am involved in a lot of things with the tribe. I'm actually super excited. The man I just mentioned, Jay Hanna, over at Bank First, has been instrumental in getting Wilma Mankiller onto a quarter. Finally, Wilma Mankiller was the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, and she's going to be on a limited release quarter that's coming out June 6th. So I'm driving out to the Capitol for this big ceremony that he's putting on out there because I'm super excited about some of that. The Cherokee Nation's capital is in Tahlequah, so our reservation is in the northeastern part of the state. The capital is right in downtown Tahlequah, and there's some great museums there. We're actually the Cherokee Nation, there's 3 tribes of Cherokees, the largest one being the Cherokee Nation. We have just over 413,000 citizens, making us the largest indigenous tribe in North America. So it's a good place to go visit if you're looking for cultural activities. More fun if you're looking for authentic cultural things. So I'm telling you all of this so that what I'm about to share with you to see will make sense. My family obviously survived the Trail of Tears, and we have all the stories about that, but we've been connected with a group of families for a very, very long time, back in what we call the old country. My family originally lived on a mountaintop on the border between Alabama and Georgia. It was called Scraper Mountain at the time. It's now called Bogan's Peak. In fact, the Cherokee County, Alabama Historical Society talks about how from Salem Methodist Church at the bottom of Scraper Mountain, you could see the cabin of Chief Scraper at the top of the mountain, which we located a few years ago. I've got a whole story about that. So I'm telling you all that to say that it's a big part of my life. I do dance badly, and I also play the flute worse than I dance. But also I speak it pretty well. Yeah, absolutely. I'll play the flute badly for you if you're okay. I'll bring my flute in next week and I'll play that. My dad plays much better than I did before dementia got him to the point where he can't use his fingers as well. We used to go. Do you know where Red Rock Canyon is here in the state? Dad and I, we have a Methodist camp out there, and Dad and I used to attend events out there, and we take our flutes out, and we sit and play in the canyon, and you could hear it, echoing off the. It was really beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to share with you the Indian stuff, and then I'm going to teach you Hebrew stuff. So. A couple of things. One is, last week, right, I sent around the Hebrew Bible, okay, and I told you that I also had a Greek and a Cherokee one. So this is the New Testament in Greek, and this is the New Testament in Cherokee, which I speak much better. Somebody asked me last week if I could actually read Hebrew, And the answer to that is no. I can translate Hebrew if I have the right tools, but I cannot just sit down and read through it, I guess the other way. I can't just do that. I can pretty well do that with Greek, and I can pretty well do that with Cherokee, although this is a translation of Cherokee that is a little bit older than the dialect that I speak, so some of it's a little hard for me. All that said, what is neat about this is that Dad taught Greek, and I took Greek, obviously, but this is an old version of Greek called Koine Greek, so it's not modern, it's ancient. You have to know about 3,000 words. You have to have a 3,000 word vocabulary to be conversational in it, whereas you only have to have about 1,000 word vocabulary to be conversational in modern English. So that should tell you that there are a lot of ways to express things in Greek. Well, you're going to think I'm lying about this, and I'm not. Go look it up on Google, because Google never lies. We have a bunch, we're working hard to make sure our language doesn't die. And so we have a bunch of native speakers, and by native we mean, I'm a native speaker, but I don't speak as fluently as people for whom it is their first language. There are still members of our tribe who grew up speaking Cherokee in the home before they ever learned English. I'm the opposite way. I learned English and Cherokee alongside of that. I would be considered a broken Cherokee speaker by the people in my tribe. Here's why. Our verb conjugations are impossible, whereas Greek, you can't translate from Greek to English one for one, because the word order is out of place, and sometimes you have one word that means two words or vice versa. So you have to read the sentence in Greek and then write it the way that it would be said in English. Does that make sense? In Cherokee, we have entire words that would be a sentence in English. So the prefix, the root, and the suffix, and sometimes another suffix determine exactly what the word is. So there are words, and this is what you're going to think I'm lying about, that have over 3,000 different conjugations, which makes it really tough to learn. But once you understand how the principles work, it's not quite so bad. So I'm going to send these around, because the other neat thing about this is that when Samuel Worcester, is one of the people who translated from Greek to Cherokee, he also walked with the tribe on the Trail of Tears. I'll bring these down to you. Thank you. The neat thing about this is that a lot of translations into other languages of the scriptures are translations from English. When they translated that, they translated it directly from Greek to Cherokee, which is neat because you can nuance meanings better. So feel free to look through those. I thought you might enjoy that. Then while I was out there yesterday, I got a couple of things, and I thought you might just be interested in this. So I'm going to put these down for you to look at when you want to. Well, let me talk about them first. So this is my eagle feather. This is a bald eagle feather. It is a fun fact. It is actually illegal to have one of these if you're not registered or a member of a federally recognized Indian tribe. And there is a difference between that and state-recognized tribes. But there are only a couple of ways to get one of these and be able to keep one. And one is for it to be, for us to be given it to you by a medicine person or an elder, usually an elder woman. Our society is matrilineal, and so usually it's an elder woman that needs to give you one. Also, that's really where your name should come from, but most of the time, but I can talk about that at length. Got this from an elder Cherokee woman in one of my previous congregations in whose family it had been for quite some time. And so usually we'll take that back to, when we are gifted one, we will take it back to the reservation and let some of the elders keep it for a little while. They do some things that nobody knows about, and then we get it back. And so they had it for me so that it could be mine and not that family's. And I just got it back the other day, so I'm excited to have it back, and I'm excited to have it officially kind of connected to my family now. So I'm going to put it down there for you to look at. I don't actually know how long it's been around because she didn't know how long it had been in her family, but she gave it to me before she passed, and she was in her 90s. And so I'm excited. I'll put that down for you to look at. It's fine with me if you pick it up, but please do be careful about touching it. It is kind of old. It sits in my office. Okay. The other thing that we often end up getting from the reservation, we have some heirloom seeds that are pre-colonial seeds. They come from plants that were grown prior to European contact. When medicine people, which is a big part of our cultural history, and I probably should restate some or share some of this because there's a lot of myth about how that works in indigenous culture. A lot of our medicine people are responsible for maintaining and passing down our culture. And so there are a number of ways that they do that. One is to write down a lot of the different, what we have called for a long time medicine, we would refer to probably in modern secular society as herbal remedies. You just get a lot of teas made up of different kinds of roots, usually. But one of the herbs that is used, or one of the plants that is used in a lot of things, is tobacco, sacred tobacco. And so this tobacco that I have here with me today is one of many things that I get when I'm out there. This is pre-colonial. It's grown from pre-colonial tobacco. So it's tobacco that's been grown by the same families since before European contact and was brought out here on the trail. I'll put it down there for you to look at. It smells, it has a very bland smell. And it has a very different impact than commercial tobacco does. And then this is cedar. If you have ever heard anybody talk about blessing a home using a traditional indigenous kind of a, home cleansing, they'll talk about sage, using sage. Our medicine people always laugh at that because there are a number of things that they miswrite so that what they actually do won't ever be known, and one of them is that. People who do that, I have some friends who try to do the same thing, they will use sage to do what they call smudging a home, which is not what that is used for, because sage is, the traditional native belief is that those herbs bring things in, whereas tobacco pushes things out. For most of the southeastern tribes, the plant that they will use for ceremonial purposes is cedar. And cedar that is particularly from a tree that's been struck by lightning is of great value. And so we use it for all kinds of things, but when I was talking with my friend that I went to go see, he was all excited because he had been waiting. He's 76 years old, and he had been waiting most of his life for a tree to be hit by lightning. And he was like, finally it happened. And he's like, he ran outside, starts cutting the rest of the tree down, He was really excited about it. A couple of reasons I have these. The vast majority of our tribe is Christian, like the vast majority of our tribe is Christian. And we've always held clerics, what we would call clerics, in high esteem. And so there are still, and I've been asked to, actually, what I'm about to tell you, I've been asked to do by Native people in our congregation. A lot of the time, there will be asked by indigenous Christians to bless the home using some traditional Christian Cherokee or Creek or Choctaw prayers. And when we do that, we'll often bring in some of the cultural elements from our tribe. So we'll bring in some cedar or bring in an eagle feather or something like that as we pray over the home that we're blessing. So I'm going to put those down for you to look at. It is perfectly fine to take a look at them if you want to. I just thought you might enjoy it since we were talking about that last week, and I had a chance to go get some of that tomorrow. I'm glad you think so. Thank you. Okay. The last home blessing I actually did was for some other members who are Choctaw as well. So we stomp dance is a major culture activity for us. I'm sorry? I can attend. I do not have enough status. That you have to have a particular position to be in the parts of the dance that you're in. So I am allowed to attend, and I keep hoping that. Oh, I can't dance. Not that way. I would get in trouble for that. But I'll tell you what it is. So the stomp. Okay. You've heard of powwows? Anybody attended a powwow? Okay, powwow is actually an older, it's a newer version of an older Plains Indians gathering. You didn't know you were going to get all this today, did you? Newer version of an old Plains gathering. We had trade languages. The version of the trade language we used in the Southeast was actually a version of Creek and Choctaw. The Plains language was a modified version, like Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota are all dialects of the same language. Omaha and Ponca are dialects of the same language, and they're very closely related to Lakota. So the trade language kind of develops around some of those, right? Powwow's a time to trade. We do powwows today for cultural reasons, but the real culture for southeastern tribes is preserved in the stomp dance, which we do not do publicly. We do that privately. There have to be stomp grounds. You go to a stomp ground, and that stomp ground is maintained by a whole lot of culture and a whole lot of tradition and a whole lot of people who hold specific positions within the tribe. So like the stomp ground that I can attend is the largest stomp ground in the Cherokee Nation, one of few that's left. We have about 1,000, there's about 1,000 members of the stomp, and then sometimes 8,000 to 10,000 people who show up to be there. It takes something like, they were telling me the other day, 13, 14 people just to prepare the ground and get it ready. There's a way we light the fire. But the way a stomp is a whole event. You spend part of the time listening to sermons in Cherokee. Often we'll play stickball together, which of all the things I do, that one I'm actually okay at, or at least I was when I was younger. We'll eat together, and then we'll start dancing. So the way a stomp, the reason it's called a stomp is because the women in our tribe, typically you dance led in a circle counterclockwise by usually the head man and the head woman, but you go man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, all the way around. And the guys will usually wear cowboy stuff with a traditional, what we call a ribbon shirt. You've probably seen those at powwows. If we have a feather, we'll put that in our hat, only if you have one. And then the women will wear tear dresses. And so around their legs, they wear these shackles. I have a friend who's getting some made right now that have tortoise shells filled with rocks. They end up being really pretty heavy, right? And there's several of them on a shackle that goes around each calf. And so they'll walk around in short steps, and when we stomp, the shell shackles on the legs of our women make the sound. The southeastern tribes, we have drums that we've used for different things, but they're not the big powwow drums you see that the Plains tribes use. Ours are smaller handheld drums that we use for some of our traditional dances at different times of the year. When we dance, normally, we dance to the sound of the stomp, right? So they'll go around, they'll sing songs. There's several songs in Cherokee. There's several songs that are almost identical between the Cherokee stomps and the Creek stomps. The Cherokees and the Creeks have the biggest set of stomps here in the state that we live in right now. The Choctaws are actually trying to rekindle theirs. Seminoles are doing the same thing. In case you didn't know this, the Cherokee our language is of Iroquoian stock. So we come down from the Great Lakes sometime in antiquity, and our language is considered the only Southern Iroquoian language. So like Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, they're all similar. Down here, Creek and Seminole are essentially almost the same language because the Seminole tribe breaks away from the Creek tribe shortly after European contact and ends up working their way down in Florida, where they fight fiercely to try to stay put. U.S. history books teach that entirely incorrectly, as if they were their own tribe that was in Florida since antiquity. They weren't. They're Creek, and Seminole actually is a Creek word. Choctaw and Chickasaw are the same way. The Chickasaw break away from the Choctaw, and their language, the Chickasaw language, is a variation now of the Choctaw language. So probably a lot more history than you ever cared about, but the stomp is where we preserve a lot of those traditions, and that will go all night long until 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning. It's a great opportunity for fellowship, for family. We sit under eaves, almost like an old brush arbor meeting, according to our clan. There's 7 of those. I'm in the Paint clan. And so it's a good time. All right, so without any further ado, I thought you might enjoy some of that since I had the chance to go out there yesterday, and we talked about it a little bit last week. Where's this? Where's this at? Oh, okay. I bet there were some powwow dances out there. Yeah, I bet that's what was going on. Most of the stomps are like super hard to find. Like they're hard to find. I think half of the way you get accepted is by finding it. You know, if you found it, then yeah, we'll let you in. But you know, Oh, okay. 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 There's a couple of decent-sized powwows that happen in and around the metro, but there's, of course, you know, they're all over the state. When you get the book or the Bible, the front of it will say, you've got the words there, Cherokee New Testament, and then you've got it in Cherokee in the syllabary, and I don't know if it's written phonetically there or not. I don't think it is. I think it's just in the syllabary, but it says Chalagi, so the first decline is Chalagi, which is this dialect's way to say Cherokee. Iche is new. It's also our color for green. Our language is very descriptive, so green is the color for new things, which is Iche Yushti is our word for spring because it's the time of the green colors. Then Gunonode is testament, but it means something more like contract. So that's what you get on the front of the book. All right. That was a lot longer than I intended to spend on that, but when have I not done that? So, well, thank you. I am glad. I love to talk about all things theological and indigenous. So, if you ever have any questions about that, I'll probably do the Lord's Prayer in Cherokee one of these days in the near future, when it's the right time. We're at chapter 15 today, and this is for a lot of us who have sat through. Some of y'all were talking about some of the classes that you've already gone through in your Bibles. If you're like me, you probably got notes written, about all of those different classes. You will have heard me talk about covenants. So this is going to be a refresher if you have heard that before, which I'm going to go ahead and go through because I think it's incredibly important in terms of connecting some of the dots between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But it's also an incredibly important way to connect the dots of our own New Testament theology. You do not understand New Testament theology without understanding the process of covenant making and how deeply rooted that is at the core, at the very beginning, at the very inception of our faith. So we're going to talk about that in chapter 15 because that's what chapter 15 is about. And then I'm excited. Actually, we're not going to meet next week because I have to go to annual conference. And chapter 16 should be, read about chapter 16 a little bit between now and 2 weeks from now. And then I want to say, let me double check because I think it's chapter 22. 21. Chapter 16 and chapter 21. There are, these are the chapters that identify beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Islamic faith or the Muslim faith is both originated by God and connected to the Jewish faith. There are a number of people, especially after 9/11, there's always been a dialogue and debate about whether or not Muslim people believe in a different God than Judeo-Christian people do. That's not true. Muslim people do not believe in a different God. We believe some different things about the same God, but we're all called to collectively the religions of the book because the origination of our faith comes from the same story, literally. And so we're going to talk about that. It is chapter 16 in which God will promise to Hagar that her son Ishmael will both be born and be made into a great nation. And it's in, well, I believe that starts there. Chapter 21 is after Hagar and Ishmael are kicked out of the presence of Abraham because Sarah gets jealous. And God promises that, that's where he promises that Ishmael will be turned into a great nation. In chapter 16, he promises that Ishmael would be stubborn and nobody will like him. But then in chapter 21, he promises that he'll be made into a great nation that is going to be blessed by God. Meaning it is the God, our God, the only God who makes that promise. So read up a little bit about that in the dialogue around. It'll make for some good conversation next week. This week, let's take a look at chapter 15 together. The scriptures are holy, and before we consider them, we should pray. Let's do that. God, we are grateful for the opportunity to dialogue about our faith and our shared life together, to talk about how deeply embedded your desire to heal and redeem us is even at the point of inception of our religion. God, we pray that your Holy Spirit would work in and through us, that you would guide us, and that you would open our hearts and our minds and our spirits to receive whatever instruction you would have us receive today that will help us to not only know you better, but to take another step toward becoming the people you've called us to be. This we ask in your name. Amen. Chapter 15. All right, so first, to set the stage, and this is what will be a refresher. Please ask questions. One of the, I also teach spiritual growth. I stepped back a little bit from the Order of St. Patrick this year, but I teach spiritual growth there, and I always teach the same thing every year, because one of the things I was taught the number of times I listened through that and listened through this was you learn something new each time you hear it. And that's true. It's built on my faith every time I've heard that, every time I've heard this. So, just to set the stage, there is a process for making a covenant in the ancient world, particularly in the ancient Near East. That was identified and has been identified for a very long time. I can give you all the books to read about it. They're pretty boring, and they say the same thing, which is it's a thing, and it's been around for a while. There are several different kinds of covenants. Now, to set the stage, we need to understand that when we talk about, to talk about covenants in the ancient world is also to talk about contracts. Our word for that is contract. Christians today will preach about covenant, sometimes in a modern context, and try to give it more meaning than the idea of a contract had. And that's good. Those sermons are good. I get that, and I'm all behind it. But in the ancient world, that word, which is berit, it is written, and somebody asked me about this in the Beidab, and I really wanted to get them on the screens, but I'm having trouble with that. So to backtrack, somebody asked me how to spell Beidab, which is the word for clan. Promised to do that this week. It is spelled B-E space T-A-B, Beidab. And the T is pronounced as a D, so it's written Beidab. Now there's accents on that, but I'm not even going to try to communicate those. B-E space T-A-B is Beidab, and it means clan or family, right? Berit. Berit is the word that translates to covenant. Today it would translate to contract, and it is spelled B-E space R-I-T. B-E space R-I-T, and it's pronounced Berit. It's two different consonants in Hebrew. So when we talk about covenant, you need to think about that in the context of a contract, right? This is the process for making a contract between two parties, between two people, between two nations. It's just the contract-making process. When you're talking about the process of doing that between two nations, think of that in terms of a treaty, okay? Same kind of thing. So when we're talking about two nations, it would be in the terms of a treaty. Now this happens a lot, and the largest number of examples that come out of antiquity about this process are actually between countries. A large country, large powerful country, and a smaller country. There's another set of words we need to know for that, and they are suzerain and vassal. Suzerain is spelled S-U-Z-E-R-A-I-N. S-U-Z-E-R-A-I-N. Vassal is spelled V-A-S-S-A-L. Suzerain means more powerful ruler or powerful ruler, right? So when we talk about a covenant between a suzerain and a vassal, which is how this is written about historically, we're talking about a covenant between a suzerain, which if we're looking at this in the context of making a treaty between two countries, which is how it most frequently appears, then the suzerain is the more powerful nation. So think of the suzerain as the leader of a very powerful nation. Pharaoh in Egypt would be a good example of that. Vassal is a smaller state. Now we use that term a little more frequently, even in a modern context, so it's probably familiar. But a vassal is a smaller state. They can't offer as much, right? And so when a treaty is made between a suzerain and a vassal, then there usually, in antiquity, are some things that go along with that, which means there's a process, right? The process kind of looks like this. There's a preamble, and the preamble is essentially a set of introductions. Here's who I am, and here's who you are, right? The best examples of this come out of the second millennia BCE, and they are called second millennia BCE Hittite, which is the name of the people group, suzerain vassal treaties. So if you ever want to look it up, just ask me again, and I'll just type that out and send it to you so you can read all about it. But that's where they come from. The way that works is there's going to first be a preamble, and the preamble not only says, here's who I am and here's who you are, but I'm more powerful than you, ostensibly powerful enough to squash you, right? Then you go into, with regard to the covenant between, now everything we're going to talk about is mirrored between the secular practice of the time, which is hard to identify because most of the cultures then were, the word escapes me, theocracies. Most of them were theocracies, meaning there was not the separation of church and state that has become common for secular governments of our generation, of our time. your faith and subsequently the deity was not only an important but an expected part of government influence and scope, right? So, but in spite of that, so while that separation is difficult, we're talking about secular things. The contract, the covenant process we're going to go through here in Genesis, a little more in Exodus, or a little bit in Exodus, quite a bit in Leviticus, a lot in Deuteronomy, follows that process almost to a T. In fact, you can Google this yourself, and you can get a whole series of examples of ancient treaties, and they'll break them down next to the Old Covenant so you can see which parts match up to the way that was done. It's simple to do. Now, the reason that matters is because there's something happening here that is indicative of God's character. When God chooses to make a promise here to Abram, and what God is going to make a promise about Abram's descendants and where they're going to live, also rescuing them. When God chooses to make a promise to Abram, he doesn't just say, here's what I'm going to do, trust me. He goes through a really well-known process that obligates him according to the way that things are done, which is a way to give Abram and subsequently his descendants peace of mind that what God is going to do, that God will do what God has said that God will do, right? Which means that when we preach from the pulpit or the stage theology that God will meet you where you are, that the first example of that, and there are many, comes very early in the story of our faith. God comes down to meet us where we are. God could just say, Abram, I'm going to do it. I don't need to give you any assurance. I'm going to do it. And trust me, you should, because I'm more powerful than you. Instead, he not only follows this time-honored process of treaty making between a more powerful figure and a less powerful figure, but also changes it. He switches up one thing dramatically, which you'll have heard me talk about, that changes everything about what we understand about God's character, right? So we go from the preamble, here's who I am, the preamble, here's who I am, here's who you are. One of the things that differs between the Hebrew covenant and what we see in the other ancient Near Eastern covenants coming out of different cultures is that they often don't have what is called a historical prologue, which the Hebrew covenant does. I am the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You're going to see that in other parts of the script. That's the preamble, right? Who brought your ancestors up out of the land of Egypt is the historic prologue. You don't see that in other ancient Hittite second millennia covenants. You don't see that historic prologue. One of the interesting things about that is that in the historical prologue, which you see actually a couple of times in the Old Testament, what God says is, essentially, by saying, because you've heard that, right? If you grew up in the church, you've heard, I am the God of your fathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. You've heard that read somewhere before, and probably just kind of skimmed over it. Yes, God, we know that you did that, The interesting thing about that is that God is saying in the historical prologue, which changes everything about the covenant, and I get excited about, God is saying there, I already acted on your behalf. So before there are any stipulations made of you, I acted on your behalf. And we're about to see where God is going to promise to do that right here. God is going to say, your ancestors are going to be in a land not their own, and they're going to be persecuted for 400 years. It's actually 430 that it ended up being. And then God says, I'm going to punish the nation that is persecuting them. I'm going to rescue them, and they're going to leave with great wealth, which is very similar. Also, same country that Abram went to with Sarai, right? Sarai, ostensibly, by their standards, gets persecuted or treated illy, and they leave with great wealth after God punishes Pharaoh, right? That's almost, we call that in theological study type and typology, which is always hard. I think those are terrible words because they don't at all explain what they're trying to say. Essentially, you're looking at foreshadowing lived out. What you see happen with Abram in Egypt is on a small scale what's going to happen with all of Israel in Egypt someday, and you see it kind of working itself out ahead of time. So we have this historical prologue in which God is saying, I have already done things on your behalf. So when you enter into, the whole rest of the covenant works itself out such that what God ends up saying is, when you enter into covenant with me, do it because I've already loved you first. Whereas every other covenant in the ancient Near East uses threat and posturing to make sure that the vassal state complies with the terms of the covenant. Does that make sense? So whereas in the other examples of this in the ancient Near East, you get usually land grant in exchange for military service. The higher ranking party is going to grant land, which guess what? We are about to see happen. And the lower ranking party has to promise military service. So think about every movie that you've ever watched about knights and kings and queens, where the king or the queen calls all of their vassals to come and fight for them in a time of war, same kind of thing. What do they get in return? Land granted by the leader. But in response to that land, they are going to have to pay taxes, and they're also going to have to come to the aid of the king or the queen whenever they're called to duty, right? Well, here, you're going to see some stipulations and obligations that are given, but interestingly, instead of saying you should, at the beginning of the whole contract, you should do this because I'm more powerful than you, God says, I am more powerful than you and have already shown you that I love you by stepping up and being there when your people needed me before there was ever any reason for me to do that. That's called a historical prologue. Then we're going to go through obligations and stipulations. I will do this, you will do this. In an ancient treaty, it's going to be land grant and military service and taxes. I'm going to give you land, and I'm going to call all of my vassals to come to your aid. So if your little country, your little vassal state gets attacked, I'm going to bring everybody to defend you, right? And if somebody else gets attacked, you're going to join the whole group of us going to defend them, right? So you'll get land and you'll get protection, usually in exchange for taxes and military support, obligations and stipulations. If you do, and this is what that means, if you do those things correctly, you pay your taxes and show up when you're called, then lots and lots of good things will come to you. If not, then you'll be punished. And several times in antiquity, there are whole vassal states that are attacked by the much larger fighting force. In fact, we just saw some of that happen a couple of chapters, or in the last chapter that we studied in Genesis. So we go through obligations and stipulations, at the end of which is a provision for the periodic rereading of the covenant, which normally has to be done in most cultures once a year at a festival of some kind. The covenant is reread, and sometimes the ratification ceremony is reenacted. That correlates directly to our practice of Holy Communion. That, for us, that is what Holy Communion is. It is the periodic rereading of the terms of the covenant, which was inaugurated by Christ at the Last Supper. So when Christ is at the Last Supper, Christ also follows this protocol in the creation of the new covenant, even and including the ratification and the sacrifice that's necessary, which incidentally is why sacrifice is necessary. People struggle with this because we don't often have an opportunity to encounter the history of our own faith. The reason sacrifice was necessary is because sacrifice was necessary to inaugurate the covenant, period. This covenant, and that's what happens after that stipulation. So stipulation for the periodic rereading of the covenant, going to happen once a year at a festival. We're going to reread it. We might reenact the ratification ceremony. Who knows? There will be a feast. But it has to be done once a year so that the vassal state can be reminded of its obligations, period. After that's done, then you go into the actual ratification ceremony. And that's what we're going to read through here, which is why it's important to know about. If you don't, you're probably not going to, A, find it in this reading, and B, half of it is not going to make any sense at all. What is the flaming fire pot about? You know, here's what happens. In the ratification ceremony, after all those things have happened, right? The preamble, the historical prologue, obligations and stipulations, periodic provision for periodic rereading of the covenant. After that, we're going to ratify it. And if the ratification ceremony doesn't happen, it's not considered valid, right? For us, that would be akin to something needing to be notarized or something like that. So if the ceremony doesn't happen, then it's not a valid covenant, and nobody's obligated to it. So here's what the ceremony looks like. It's going to begin with sacrifice, an animal sacrifice. Why? Because sacrifice is a necessary part of every major religion throughout all of the Near East, most of the world, including ours. Sacrifice is a major part of our faith as well. Our faith just accounts for the one sacrifice made in response to the covenant that's happening here, which is why you and I don't continue to do that as a part of our faith practice, right? Sacrifice is necessary to, and I want to say this carefully because when I teach this sometimes, we're teaching this in a Christian theological context, but the practice didn't just happen in ancient Israel or in an ancient Hebrew context. It happens for everybody, right? So as far as the practice was concerned, it didn't matter what the deity was that was a part of your culture. It didn't matter what your religion was. Whatever, whether it was a Canaanite religion or in this case the Yahwistic religion, whatever it was, the belief was, and in antiquity, particularly in the ancient Near East, you have a group of people who are simultaneously extremely comfortable with plurality and also fight each other a lot over it. So on the one hand, they're real comfortable with the idea that their thought being there's multiple religions. In their pantheon or in their religious practice, you may never have been taught this before. It opened up a lot about history to me when somebody taught this in a class I was in. Most of the time, in antiquity, your religion was related to your culture, not your belief system. The gods that you followed were gods that you followed according to their, how they viewed the world. The gods you followed were related to your ethnic and cultural context. So if you were Canaanite, then the Canaanite gods were your gods. If you were Hebrew, then Yahweh was your God. I could keep going with that. That is one of the reasons that when Christianity and ancient Hebrew, the ancient Israelite faith is no different. There are a whole lot of stipulations all throughout Deuteronomy about what people who are not ethnically Hebrew can and cannot do when they're around particularly the temple, for instance. There's places they can't go inside the temple. There are people to whom salvation is not available because they're not ethnically Hebrew. That's a major part of the origination of our faith. Here's what changes. When our faith transitions from its Hebraic, which is how you say that, origins, to Christianity, Paul makes this big case in Romans about how Christians are the theological ethnic ancestors of ancient Judaism. For us today, we're like, why does that matter? The reason that mattered is because in antiquity, your faith practice was connected to your ethnicity. This would have represented the first time, maybe the first time ever. I don't know enough about history to know that. Certainly the first time in a Near Eastern religion, where the advent of Christianity, first time in a Near Eastern religion, where what you believe dictates what your faith is. So apart from my ethnic heritage, that's why there's such a conflict about ethnic Jews and Greeks in the New Testament. They can't be a part of us. They're not ethnically us. And all of the apostles are saying, it's not how it works anymore. And people are like, we can't wrap our mind around that. You know why? Because the origination of the phrase, we've never done it that way before, goes way back into our religious history, right? We've never done it that way before. And they're like, we know, but we're doing it that way now. And they're like, well, you can't do it that way now. And they're like, well, why not? And they're like, I don't know, because we've never done it that way before. So they're arguing about this for a while. Very different thing. Normally, it's connected to your ethnic heritage. Why does that matter for us right now? Because it was the deity associated with your culture that had to oversee the covenant. That was just a part of the government. If you're in a theocracy, then there's no separation between church and state. The priests have a role to play in the administration of the government, right? So the deity has to oversee this. When the deity is overseeing this, we will, as part of the ratification ceremony, while that's happening, sacrifice animals to the deity, in this case Yahweh, to ratify the covenant. And when we do, we will take those animals, typically the ones that are edible, we will split them in half, or, I know this is gross, and I'm sorry, but we will split them in half, or we will dismember them and also cut their heads off. Aren't you glad that we just need to get something notarized today, as way less disgusting? But then the lower ranking party, you've heard me say this, walks between the pieces of the animal and says, if I fail to live up to the terms of the covenant, then may what happened to this animal happen to me. There are several examples of that. There's an example of that in Jeremiah as well happening, where the lower ranking party walks between the animal and says that. So it could be between the halves of the split animal, could be between the dismembered portions of the animal, and it could be just the leader of the vassal state, or it could be the leader of the vassal state and their entire administration. It could also have been their family members, indicating that if they failed to live up to the standards of the covenant, all of their families would be eradicated as well, and that's something that happened in antiquity. So they'll do this, they'll walk between the pieces of the animal. Then, after that's been done, and the suzerain, remember that word, never does that. because the suzerain can't be killed for failing to live up to the obligations of the covenant. Only the vassal can. If the suzerain fails, then the vassal is ejected from the covenant. So, while the suzerain is overseeing this, under the auspices of the deity, the sacrifices happen, the vassal walks between the animals. Once all that's done, half of the animal is sacrificed as a burnt offering on the altar. We actually do not properly call that an altar in the Christian faith. It's called a communion table because there's one sacrifice, we call it the one oblation of Christ. There's one sacrifice that has been made good for all time, so we don't sacrifice anymore, therefore it's not an altar. This actually is not even meant to represent an altar, which is what a sacrifice is performed on. It is meant to represent a table around which Christ celebrated the Last Supper, which is why it houses the communion elements. In traditional Christianity, it was actually Protestantism that started putting other things on the communion table. Bible came first, the Bible and the cross, and candles, which were only there so that you could read the Bible, which was on the communion table, right? Prior to that, and still in some versions of the faith, only the communion elements can be on the communion table. Nothing else is on there. So you won't see decorations, you won't see a cross, you won't see candles, you won't see a Bible, just the communion elements, because it's meant to represent the table at the Last Supper. That's the whole point to the thing. Now, we'll still hear people call it altars because, old habits die hard. But properly speaking, it's not. It's a communion table. All right, so half of the animal is burnt on the altar as a burnt offering to the deity, and the other half is prepared, cooked, and eaten at a festival feast by both the suzerain and the vassal. Both of them, listen to this, have to eat of the animal in order for the treaty to be valid. That should connect with you because there's a moment when Christ says, unless you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you'll have no part of me, right? In this case, Christ is the sacrificial lamb, which is where that term comes from. The term sacrificial lamb comes from this process that I just explained to us, all right? Now that that's happened, let's read through it together. Take a look at it, watch as we go through this, and you're going to see those things come out. And then, because most of us have sat through this before, you're going to see the moment in which God changes the way this is done. And instead of the vassal, which would be Abram, walking between the pieces of the animal, they're going to cut the pieces of, it's like a heifer and something. They'll cut the heifer or whatever it is in half. They won't cut the birds in half. Abram's going to go into a deep sleep, which is the explanation of the presence of the theophany, which I'll talk about in a minute. But then this flaming pot is going to pass between the pieces of the animal. Look for that. We're going to stop there and talk about it in a little bit more detail. But that is a moment, that's an epic change. If you're hearing this and you come from anywhere in this region and you're Hebrew or not, that's a jaw-dropping moment because what God does there is not something that powerful people or other gods in their pantheonic understanding would do. Let's read it together. So after first we're going to have the covenant promises, and then we'll move into the covenant ceremony. 15. After these events, the Lord's word came to Abram in a vision, which is common, almost like a dream, but Abram has to be put to sleep first, which also happens repeatedly throughout the entirety of Scripture, from the beginning of it to the end of it. God will come to somebody in a dream. And in the cultures that we're talking about, we are, I've said this before, probably the most skeptical generation, and I use generation the same way it's used in the Bible to mean culture. We are the most skeptical generation I think that's ever lived. In this time period, if it came in a vision, you can't argue it. It was God talking to you, period. Just can't argue it. It wouldn't even cross their mind to argue, right? So it comes to Abram in a vision. We're supposed to be like, oh, it's really God. That's what we're supposed to do. Don't be afraid, Abram. I am your protector. Your reward will be very great. So there's a negative imperative here, don't be afraid, which often happens when God appears. Same thing happens when the announcement is made about the birth of Christ to the shepherds. The angels come. Don't be afraid. Because it's terrifying, right? That's a terrifying thing. So the first thing God does is be like, don't be afraid. Oh, okay. I am your protector actually is not that. In Hebrew it says I am your shield, but it means essentially the same thing. Your reward will be very great. So I'm going to promise you things. The covenant, the cutting of the covenant, remember it's called cutting a berit, particularly because we're cutting the animals, right? We're cutting the covenant. That is starting right now. So God is about to make a series of promises. But Abram said, Lord God, what can you possibly give me since I have no children? The head of my household is Eliezer, a man from Damascus, he continued. Since you haven't given me any children, the head of my household will be my heir, which is common, right? If you don't have any children, remember this is a patriarchal, patrilineal, patrilocal society, so inheritance has to go to the oldest male heir. If you don't have any kids, you can adopt somebody as essentially the heir so that your family line continues. Same thing as the requirement that if, in ancient Hebrew society, if a woman is widowed, her deceased husband's brother is supposed to father children with her. In their culture, whether he has a family or not, supposed to father children with her, and the children of that union become the children of his dead brother or her dead spouse, who can then inherit so that the family line continues, right? Because that's how things are done in their culture. So in this case, you can adopt if you don't have anybody else, but if Abram and Sarai, if they adopted Eliezer, right, and Abram and Sarai have a child, which is going to happen, Eliezer is, his status goes away. No longer is he going to inherit things. Now it's going to be the actual legitimate firstborn child, which is something that is going to happen with Ishmael too. The Lord's word, verse 4, came immediately to him. So God is speaking directly to Abram, right, in a vision. This man will not be your heir. Your heir will definitely be your very own biological child. Great gift to Abram in this culture. Then he brought Abram outside and said, now a few minutes, if we were reading, a few weeks ago, we saw that he brought him out and had him look at the sand, and it's like your descendants will be as numerous as the grains of sand here, right? Now he's going to look at the sky. Look up at the sky and count the stars if you think you can count them, he continued. This is how many children you will have. This is a prophecy. God is making a prophecy here. It is a promise, it's a covenant promise, but it's also a prophecy. He's going to do that again in a minute, where he's going to prophesy about what will happen to his descendants. Abram trusted the Lord, and the Lord recognized Abram's high moral character. Do you have a version that says, and it was credited to him as righteousness? It's a common translation. Again, much like some of the phrases we've seen in other parts of this story, this is not happening because Abram was good. This is a recognition that Abram is good, period. Be more like Felicia that we met over Exchange Avenue Baptist. Like when we're like, man, she's an amazing person. That's what's happening here. Not, we like her because she's an amazing person. She's just an amazing person. There's just a statement being made there. Abram is a good dude. That's what you're getting at this. They probably should have translated it that way. And the Lord recognized that Abram was a good dude. All right, verse 7. He said to Abram, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. Historical prologue. So I am the Lord, and here's what I did. I already did this. I already brought you out of another place to this place, which I'm going to give to you. I have acted first. God's love is proactive. I have acted first. I have loved first. I chose to love before I chose to do anything else, right? So God is saying, I've already done something on your behalf. But Abram said, Lord God, how do I know that I will actually possess it? And he said, here we go. This is the part of the ceremony. How will I know that I will actually possess it, right? Essentially, how can I trust you? How can I trust that what you're saying you'll do, you'll actually do? God's like, I know how we can do this. We'll just follow the covenant-making process that's normal for you. We'll get it, it'll be ironclad, the covenant will be ironclad, the legal jargon will be there, we'll go through the whole thing so that you can trust that I'm going to follow through with what I'm supposed to do. So he says, he does that. Now, as I'm reading this, if I'm an ancient, or reading, or hearing it, as an ancient Israelite, I immediately know what's going on here. I don't need context because this is a part of my life. I understand all the context. So I immediately see that when Abram says, how can I trust this? God says, I'm going to do something you can trust so that this will work. Verse 9, he said, bring me a 3-year-old female calf, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. Verse 10, he took all of these animals, split them in half, and laid the halves facing each other, but he didn't split the birds. When vultures swooped down on the carcasses, Abram waved them off, protecting them, right? Left them there. After the sun set, Abram slept deeply. Again, we see the same thing all through the scriptures. John goes into this deep, who was here for Revelation? Anybody was here for the Revelation? Okay, or watched it maybe. John goes into this deep sleep before he's given the revelation. That's a really common theme when God is going to communicate something via a vision. Just goes into a deep sleep, right? We also know that the presence of a theophany, which is usually seen as one of two things, either an appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ, or an appearance of God manifesting in other than God's totality, because, like the scriptures tell us, to see God in God's totality without mediation would lead to death. So, God often appears in the form of fire. We use Moses in the burning bush as a good example of that because a lot of people have heard that story. You're going to see the same kind of thing happen here. So after the sunset, Abram slept deeply. In the original text, it says something like fell into a very deep trance or very deep sleep. A terrifying and deep darkness settled over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Have no doubt that your descendants will live as immigrants." So this is more prophecy, right? This is not a punishment. It is not a promise in the sense of a reward. It is a prophecy, so that Abram will know what is coming, and so that Abram's descendants will know what is coming, and that is a part of God's plan, as is their rescue, which is why, after 400 years, the people start crying out to the Lord for salvation when they're in the land of Egypt. Have no doubt that your descendants will live as immigrants in a land that is not their own, where they will be oppressed slaves for 400 years. They actually end up being there for 430 years, right? And there have been scholars over the years. I surround myself with detail-oriented people like Michelle because I know what my strengths are, sort of, and I know what my weaknesses are for sure. And I love that and love them, but there's a lot of detail-oriented scholars who are like, well, it was 430 years in Egypt, and that's different than 400 years. It couldn't have been the same thing. And everybody else is like, he was rounding. I mean, they were rounding. It was about 400 years, you know. Was there another place that or that Israel was for 400 years-ish before they were rescued? No, it was Egypt. So it was 430 years in total before Israel is actually brought out of Egypt. Here, that promise is made as 400 years, which I'm saying humorously, but there's a rounding happening here. There will be oppressed slaves for 400 years, but after I punish the nation they serve, they will leave it with great wealth. As for you, you will join your ancestors in peace and be buried after a good long life. Prophecy. This is what is ahead of you and what is ahead for your people. That's comforting, or has to be comforting, for the people of Israel who were slaves in Egypt, unless you're one of the generations, I guess, and I don't mean this in a funny way, but if you're one of the generations caught in that 400-year period where you know you're going to live and die in slavery, the only thing you can do is keep hope alive for those who are going to come after you, which is sometimes what we do. When we know that a problem is going to outlast our lifetime, then we try to give the next generation both the tools and the hope to navigate that problem and continue on, right? All right, so as for you, we did that. Verse 16. The fourth generation will return here, since the Amorites' wrongdoing won't have reached its peak until then. Now, back to the ceremony. After the sun had set and darkness had deepened. We just saw that in verse 12. The sun set, Abraham slept deeply, a terrifying and deep darkness settled over him. We're back to that now. After the sun had set, darkness had deepened, a smoking vessel with a fiery flame passed between the split open animals. We know that this is part of the ratification ceremony, but it's supposed to be Abram, right? It says, on that day, the Lord cut a covenant with Abram. All right, so there's a couple of questions here. What is happening? Because and everybody who's reading this knows that the suzerain does not walk between the pieces of the sacrificed animal, because the suzerain in that circumstance is being obligated to things that can only be obligated to the vassal. So if you're reading that or hearing the story, and this is the deity doing it, right? This is the same God that's overseeing it is the God that's making a covenant with Abram and walks between, or goes in the smoking firepot, between the pieces of the animal. What's happening? By doing that, what God is saying is, if you fail, not if I fail to live up to the terms of the covenant, but if you do, then may what happened to this animal happen to me. Right there at the beginning, at the origination of our religion, God is saying, if you fail to live up to the stipulations of the covenant, then may what happened to this animal happen to me. Which is the reason that God has to come to earth in human form, which we call God incarnate, God on earth in human form. Christ is God incarnate. God has to incarnate in human form in order to fulfill the promise that he made at the inception of the covenant. If you fail, which humanity does, we get that in the rest of the story, then may what happened to this animal happen to me. So there's two things that happen in the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, because the death of God And I'm going to say that very carefully, not the Nietzsche kind of death of God. But God has to, what happened to that animal has to happen to God in order for the covenant to be paid in full. At the same time, there has to be another sacrifice to inaugurate the new covenant because a sacrifice is necessary. So God does a couple of things that would have been unprecedented and really still are. One is God pays the price. The only way God can do that, we're like, well, God's not actually dying, right? Because God is God and is eternal and can live forever, right? But Jesus is also fully human. So the death of Jesus on the cross is the paying of that price in a grotesque and gruesome way. At the same time, the death of Christ is the sacrifice that inaugurates a brand new covenant. So there's two things happening there. Oftentimes, we focus on the one to the exclusion of the other. Meaning, we'll focus on when we say that Christ died to pay for our sins, the original way that was communicated is that Christ was sacrificed for the failure of Israel to live up to the covenant. And that has translated over time to Jesus was sacrificed for your sins. Well, strictly speaking, it was actually the other thing that Christ did that made it possible to be forgiven. The stipulations of the new covenant allow for, listen to this, forgiveness without another sacrifice. So when Christ dies on the cross, that is to fulfill the obligations of the old covenant, or said more specifically, the sins of Israel. But the sacrifice that inaugurates a new covenant inaugurates a covenant through which forgiveness does not require sacrifice because, and scholars have tried to connect what I'm just about to connect for you so that some of that will make sense. The sacrifice of Christ is the only sacrifice that was necessary in order for sins to be forgiven according to the new covenantal theology that would come later. So what does that mean? When we say that Christ died for our sins, and we're talking about the way in which Christ sacrifices Christ's self so that the new covenant can be formed in the way that it's formed, there's truth in that. But the auspices of the new covenant also, the auspices alone, the way Christ teaches the covenant, allow for forgiveness and redemption with nothing more than the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So it's splitting hairs, but it's important here. The sacrifice there that happened was the sacrifice that happened to forgive Israel for its sin, but then to inaugurate a new covenant in which your sin can be forgiven without you having to sacrifice. Often we'll focus on one to the exclusion of the other because that new covenant also comes with a new set of stipulations, which involve you and I having an access to God through Christ that the ancient Israelites, according to their covenant, did not have. They had to go through priests in order to be able to get to God and hear God from prophets. We don't have to do that because Jesus is prophet, priest, and king. So the some of, or I would say half or more, of what Christ did, what God did incarnate, happens in the inauguration of the new covenant. But there are two things simultaneously happening there. And one is what is called often substitutionary atonement, but it is just atonement. Christ is dying as a result of the covenant obligation that God took on God's self at the formation of the original covenant. And Christ is dying or sacrificing Christ's self to inaugurate a new covenant that is now different than the old covenant. So they cut a covenant. To your descendants I give this land, here we go, promises, from Egypt's river to the great Euphrates, together with the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And that brings us to chapter 16, with only 4 minutes over, which I'm honestly kind of proud of. I'm going to stick around for a minute, though, because that's a lot to digest. So if you need to leave, feel free to take off. You're not going to offend me or anybody else. If you have questions or thoughts or comments, bring them up, and I'll be glad to answer them as best I can. Or not, also not. I can also not. Incense. The good analogy, or that's a great connection to make, but actually no. That incense is actually purifying the space. I think I can certainly see where I would look at that and connect the two in my head, and I think that's a great association, but it's actually meant to purify the space. Sacralize it and sanctify it are the words I was looking for. But yes, it is more of an incense and smoke thing. But I don't think there would be anything theologically wrong with looking at that and remembering the smoking pot. That's a great association. So, saw another hand. Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's a good question. My family converted to Christianity in Salem Methodist Church, which is where that historical county had its records. It is right at the bottom of what was called Scraper Mountain. It's now Bogan's Peak. They had a series of brush arbor meetings back then. Methodists used to have brush arbor meetings all summer long, and that connected with a lot of the southeastern tribes, specifically because we sat under brush arbors at all of our stumps, and so just kind of just connected. My family converted there would have been in the very early part of the 19th century, so sometime between 1800 and 1830, my family converted. Sorry? Yeah, my family was Christian. I have members of my family who fought in the Civil War, interestingly, first for the South and then for the North, but that's a whole other story. So, but yeah, we were Christian by that point. Yes, that is the alphabet that was created by Sequoyah. Yeah, and we say Sequoyah. Sequoyah is how we say that in Cherokee. Fun questions. Anything else? You're like, no, we've had all the split open animals we can handle for today. All right. Thank you all for being here. Now remember that we're not going to be meeting next week. I will be at annual conference, and so we'll meet 2 weeks from now. And really do, if you have the time and the inclination, read up a little bit on the conversations between Judaism and Christianity and Islam about our shared origination and some of the dialogue that's arisen there, because that'll make for interesting conversation. May I pray for you? God, we're grateful for today and for the opportunity to be here and for the work that you do in and through us. We're also grateful for the way in which you have chosen to communicate to us, the way in which you have chosen to meet us where we are and give us the assurance that you will do what you have said that you will do. And so as we leave here today, God, help us to leave with that assurance that you will live up to and into the promises that you have made to us, that the promises that you've made can be trusted because you are trustworthy, because you are God who follows through. This we ask in your name. Amen. Thank you for coming.